The truth will set you free. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro repeats this Bible quote on a regular basis, but when it comes to himself, he doesn't necessarily follow the teachings of the Gospel of John. In March, the president was tested twice for COVID-19, and he says both results came back negative. However, he refuses to show any proof. One daily newspaper in Brazil has tried to obtain the documents through the Access to Information Act, but the government has fought tooth and nail to keep the tests from being released to the public. Now the matter will be decided by the Supreme Court, raising the question: can the president's health remain a private matter, or is it a state affair? My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. This is Explaining Brazil. Brazil has a long history of dramatic presidential ailments. In 1969, President Arthur da Costa e Silva suffered a stroke and was left incapacitated. The dictatorial government of the time hid his medical condition for as long as they possibly could. 16 years later, Brazil would find itself in a similar situation. Elected by Congress to become the first civilian president after 21 years, Tancredo Neves was rushed to the hospital with severe abdominal pain on the eve of his inauguration. For 39 days, the president was in the hospital, his vice president was the acting head of state, and no one knew exactly what was wrong with Tancredo. Some reports said it was diverticulitis, but it turned out to be a tumor. On April 22, 1985, the president was dead.
Lamento informar que o excelentíssimo senhor presidente da República, Tancredo de Almeida Neves, faleceu esta noite no Instituto do Coração às 10 horas e 23 minutos.
Flash forward to 2020 and we have a president who's also coy about his own health. 24 people in his inner circle fell ill to COVID-19, but the president claims he's not been contaminated himself. But in recent weeks, Jair Bolsonaro has been seen coughing and wheezing through public speeches. So was the president infected? And has he the right to keep his medical condition to himself? We welcome back as our guest this week Felipe Campante, Associate Professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Felipe, President Jair Bolsonaro was tested for COVID-19 on March 12th and March 17th. He has said that both tests came back negative, but has refused to show them. Daily newspaper Estado de São Paulo has filed a lawsuit to get a hand of these tests. They have won multiple lower court decisions until Brazil's second highest judicial body gave the president a pass and said that he could keep the results private. Now the question will be decided by the Supreme Court. And my question to you is, Jair Bolsonaro is a citizen, and as a citizen, he enjoys some rights to privacy. But the health condition of a head of state is a public matter. So when these two notions clash, which should trump the other?
Well, I mean, as you point out, obviously there are, conflicting principles here, you would say, but I think it's worth kind of thinking about this from a broader perspective, right? Once you withhold information that is potentially relevant for, political and policy outcomes, you're creating noise and you're creating potentially sort of a distorted playing field, right? One where certain people might have access to certain kinds of information, which might have even financial implications, right? It's very easy to imagine, just to kind of remove ourselves from the specific context, but just thinking about the health of a head of state or a head of government, right? And if you know something others don't, you could actually, obtain financial gain from that, right? You could play with this privileged information in the financial markets and so on. So clearly, it raises a problem, and it's not a coincidence that this type of lack of disclosure kind of reminds you of the Soviet Union back in the day, right? In the 80s, where you'd have like these leaders who were in absolutely perfect health until they like dropped dead. It's telling that this lack of transparency often is associated with this type of regime, right? Where you really do have this type of manipulation of information and so on. So I think when you think about this sort of from this broader perspective, I think it's quite clear that there are limits to the right to privacy of the head of state and the head of government that are stricter than what those would be for citizens, right? Because it really does matter for politics. It really does matter for policy, and as such, I think we have a much stronger argument, particularly in this case where all of the COVID is sort of the main theme of policy and politics, or one of the main themes for sure. Obviously, not everything, right, should be about the president should be public. There is some right to privacy, but clearly the things that are relevant from a policy, from a sort of political perspective, I think there's a much stronger argument that these should be made public.
You mentioned the behavior of the president, and that brings me to my next question, which is, let's assume he was infected by the coronavirus. He still kept meeting supporters, touching them, hugging them. What does that mean? Should the president face some kind of legal responsibilization for knowingly being contaminated? And that's a leap we're doing here because we don't know the content, the results of Jair Bolsonaro's tests. But assuming that he was infected, what does it mean in terms of responsibilization of the president, accountability of the president?
Well, first of all, I think like his behavior with respect of his refusal to release the results clearly indicates, raises the probability that the tests were actually positive. And this is one example where I think this becomes politically relevant. So I'm not a legal expert, so I'm not going to say much of anything about like whether he should be held responsible from a legal perspective. But he certainly should be held responsible from a political perspective, right? I mean, it is relevant if you have, the president behaving in completely irresponsible. I mean, it's clearly irresponsible already, regardless of the test results. But even more so, right? If he was knowingly infected and behaving the way that he has been behaving through this entire period, it clearly matters, right? It tells you something about his judgment. It tells you something about his responsibility or lack thereof, and it's clearly something that is meaningful in terms of judging the president's behavior, and it's something that the public should know precisely for that reason. That's the kind of information that should be made available precisely because it matters for accountability and for kind of judging the performance and the fitness of the president.
You said that the fact that he has not disclosed the tests raises a huge suspicion that he was indeed infected. Me personally, I think it could be just another episode in which Jair Bolsonaro is trolling us, the media, and trying to hold a bait just to make us fall on our faces again. Because if he was infected and he was not hit hard health wise, would that not go into his rhetoric that the coronavirus will only cause the sniffles and that COVID-19 is not as severe as governors are saying?
Well, I mean, certainly possible that the results are actually negative, and you could concoct a story for why he would be doing that kind of on a sort of rationally and sort of strategically doing that, and it's possible that that's the case, right? But I think more broadly, I think sort of if there is some strategy behind this, it may not be so much about like trolling the media and bolstering, like, let's say, his argument that this is a sniffles or like whatever, but more about, I think, what is one of the key hallmarks of his political approach, which is just contaminating the information environment, right, and creating noise and creating a situation where people just don't believe anything, right, which I think is a key part of sort of the political strategy. If the test results are released, whichever way they go, a lot of people would be like, "Oh, this was faked. This was, there's this conspiracy going on, or what have you." And that's part of what he wants to do, or populist leaders such as Bolsonaro want to do, which is just creating that type of environment where nothing is to be trusted, nothing is to be believed, and that's where politicians like him can flourish.
And I want to make a parallel between what we are observing right now with this controversy around Jair Bolsonaro's test and what happened to when other presidents' health conditions were important. Field Marshal Costa e Silva in the 60s, then Tancredo Neves in the 80s. So I would like to ask you to compare how these heads of state handled their health information, how that relates to what we're seeing from Jair Bolsonaro.
Well, that's an interesting sort of historical comparison. I mean, if you think about back, the 1960s example that you mentioned with Costa Silva, clearly it kind of illustrates how a non-democratic regime, deals with transparency, right, and how it fears transparency, right? If my understanding is at the time, the vice president was a civilian, right? So if the president was somehow known to be incapacitated, sort of the institutional procedure would be to have the vice president take over, and that was something that the military would not countenance, and that essentially illustrates how the lack of transparency is used to circumvent institutions and to sort of circumvent processes, right? So I think that illustrates how and why you see this type of regime being particularly associated with this type of handling and the lack of transparency. Think back to the Tancredo Neves example. I think that was also quite telling about the political context, which was one of transition, right, between an authoritarian regime and sort of like a fledgling attempt of reconstructing democracy. And again, I think sort of the reaction then was to err on the side of obscuring things, right, and not being transparent, because there was sort of this uncertainty as to how the situation would be dealt with, right? And when you have a well-functioning democracy, and when institutions are working to use the term that has become almost kind of a running joke in Brazil, when that is the case, then there you can sort of trust the process. There are procedures in place to handle situations like that, and transparency becomes the default.
With the Supreme Court being called upon to gain access to a president's medical records, we want to discuss whether Brazilian politics are becoming over-judicialized. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Laura Quirin, co-founder of the Brazilian Report. Covid-19 has created a media paradox. Audiences are going up, but for many journalism companies, revenues actually is going down. Some of Brazil's biggest media outlets are trying to cut the salaries of their reporters by up to 70%. Not us. We protect our team because they bring you the best information about Brazil in English. But we do ask you to subscribe to the Brazilian Report, which is the engine of this podcast. There, you will find new in-depth content every day, special reports, analytical newsletters. Just go to brazilian.report/subscribe. And please stay safe.
We're back with Felipe Campanti, Associate Professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Now I want to shift the subject a little bit and talk about the Supreme Court, who will ultimately rule on this question whether or not Jair Bolsonaro has to make his test results public. It's yet another episode of the Supreme Court stepping in and kind of regulating the playing field. We have seen just in these past few weeks the Supreme Court determining that the president could not name a friend of his son's to the federal police. We have seen the Supreme Court greenlighting an investigation into the president. So how do you see, and this is not something that has happened only under Jair Bolsonaro. For the past decade or 2 decades or so, we have seen the Supreme Court taking a more prominent role in Brazilian politics. How do you interpret these trends?
Well, I mean, it's quite clear that that's something problematic, right? When you have the Supreme Court taking such an active role, and I think even more so in Brazil, where more than the Supreme Court, it's as if you had like 11 Supreme Courts, right? Because each individual justice, they take these monocratic decisions that then get overturned, and there's that just adds to the overall sort of level of uncertainty and institutional noise, if you will, right? So there's a lot to be said sort of against having this type of intervention. But when you think about it, there's a sense in which it's more of a symptom of institutional dysfunction, perhaps, than cause. We economists, we have sort of this notion that we call the second best, which is the idea that there are certain things that like you would not want to have under ideal circumstances, right? Certain policies, let's say, that would clearly be non-optimal in an ideal scenario, but given all the distortions and imperfections that exist in the real world, might actually be play a positive role in the following sense. If you were to imagine, like, let's take the political and institutional situation in Brazil right now. If we were to just take the Supreme Court off the table, right, and this type of haphazard intervention from the Supreme Court off the table, would we be better off or not? And I think the answer to that is it's not clear at all that we would be better off, right? And I think one interesting point of comparison under current circumstances is the United States, where the Supreme Court is also a political player. And by the way, as we are recording this right now, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments about whether Congress should be entitled to access financial information about the president. And in the U.S., the Supreme Court is clearly a political player, but even more so, it's a partisan player, right? So you kind of expect, and it's very easy to predict how justices are going to behave based on who appointed them and their ideological proclivities, and that's something that is quite problematic as well. And in contrast, in Brazil, you have a Supreme Court that is deeply political, but because the Brazilian sort of party system is much weaker and less consolidated than the American one, it's not a partisan Supreme Court in that sense of sort of lining up with specific partisan policies or political preferences. And in that sense, the unpredictability that the Brazilian Supreme Court brings to the table has some arguably positive consequences. So the example that you mentioned, for instance, where Bolsonaro was trying to appoint a friend of the family to head the federal police, and one Supreme Court justice, right, Alexandre de Moraes, stepped in and said, like, no, you can't do that. You can say, like, look, this is clearly a dysfunctional scenario where the Supreme Court is interfering with this type of appointment, but it's checks and balances, right? Perhaps not the ideal kind of checks and balances, but it is, right? And in that sense, if you see what the Justice Department, Trump's Justice Department, has been doing, Trump has been more successful than Bolsonaro in breaking through sort of the standard checks and balances, and part of that because you have kind of this partisan structure of which the Supreme Court has become a part, right? That makes everything kind of line up in this more predictable direction.
And how do you see the behavior of the Supreme Court during Jair Bolsonaro's presidency? Because on one hand, we see justices that are actively barring the president from certain excesses, and then you have the Supreme Court Chief Justice who acts in a very docile way, always refraining himself from any sort of criticism towards the president. So, how do you see how the court is performing its role in the Jair Bolsonaro era?
Well, that's where we get back to the issue of the 11 Supreme Courts, right? Where the court rarely, if ever, speaks in unison, or even if there's dissent, there's no sense in which there's kind of like the opinion of the court in the same way that there is when you actually have a more properly functioning institutional environment. And I think that's another example of that. And as you pointed out, the behavior of the Chief Justice, Giustofoli, has been, I think you could call it like factless with respect to the executive, but more broadly with respect to the military as well, which has become a key political player, again illustrating how dysfunctional Brazilian institutions are right now. And I think that is a very problematic position for the Chief Justice to engage, and kind of appeasing, right, the authoritarian tendencies of the executive, of the president, of the military as well. So I think that's a very dangerous behavior. The Brazilian system is such that he will step down soon as Chief Justice, and someone else will step in, and that in this kind of bizarre and dysfunctional way, sort of the institutions will kind of keep chugging along. But I think that we shouldn't take that to be a source of comfort, really, because I think there is as the institutions and the Supreme Court in particular fails to act in a decisive manner and adds to the noise and to the uncertainty, it itself delegitimizes itself and the institutional environment further in a way that I think can bring long-lasting damage to Brazilian institutions. So I think it's very disturbing, and it's really lamentable the way that particularly Giustofoli has behaved under the Bolsonaro administration. And the quote unquote good news is that he won't be there for long, but the bad news is that there is lasting damage that this brings to the court and to institutions in general, and that the unpredictability of having the 11 Supreme Courts is a problem in itself that further degrades the institutional environment. So that's clearly not what you want to see, but I think the state of Brazilian institutions is so fragile right now that is hard to think what the alternatives would be at this moment. I mean, I think you can definitely say that it would be better to have a chief justice that behaves in an appropriate manner, which is definitely not the case of the current chief justice. But just the level of uncertainty and the level of turmoil that this configuration brings is certainly something that contributes to the further deterioration of the institutional environment in Brazil.
Felipe, thank you very much.
Thank you again. Always a pleasure.
If you like Explaining Brazil, please rate us with 5 stars and share this podcast with your friends. But that's not the best way to support us. Actually, you can go to our website and with as little as $3.90, you can subscribe to the best content about Brazil in English. Go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. We're bringing new content every day about how the pandemic is affecting every single aspect of life in Brazil and Latin America, all the way from the stock market to the sex industry. We also have a paywall-free COVID-19 live blog. So that's it for this week. Stay home, stay safe, and I'll see you next week.